we're looking at properties of the IS curve, we first looked at how the IS curve is downward sloping. We now want to look at shifts of IS curve. So now we want to move on to shifts in IS curve. So let's first look at what causes shifts in IS curve. Now, we looked at the IS curve is downward sloping because, like we said, when interest rate changes, that changes output to maintain goods market equilibrium. If interest rate increases, output decreases to restore goods market equilibrium. Now, what causes shifts in IS curve? Any factor that affects demand for goods, which is C plus I plus G in a closed economy. In an open economy, we would also have net exports. So any factor that affects demand for goods for any given level of the interest rate. So any factor that is changing demand for goods for any given level of the interest rate will shift the IS curve. Now, why is that? As that will change output in goods market equilibrium for any given level of interest rate. So what do we mean by this? Let's understand this with an example. So say there is an increase in G. So this would affect demand for any given interest rate. G increases, demand, which is C plus I plus G plus NX, increases for any given R. And graphically, what happens is the demand schedule shifts upwards for any given R in our goods market diagram. Right here, this was the initial demand schedule. Now it shifts upwards for any given R. Note we have R1 in both. So for any given interest rate, the schedule is going to shift upwards. As a result of this, we can see that Y increases for any given R. Here we're looking at R1. Here we're doing it for R1, that for R1, output increases, but we can see that if instead of R1, we had any other given level of interest rate, output would have increased for that given level of interest rate as well. So when G increases, demand increases for any given R. Here we're looking at R1, but it could be any given level of interest rate. We could have done it for R0, we could have done it for R2, any, right? So as a result, output increases for any given R. So IS curve shifts towards the right as one obtains higher output for any given R. Although over here we're just showing a higher output for R1, but this is true for any given interest rate that you see here. So an increase in G causes IS curve to shift towards the right as demand increases for any given R, which causes output to increase for any given R. Let's look at another example. Say we have an increase in taxes now. When taxes increase, disposable income decrease, that decreases consumption, and as a result, demand decreases for any given R. So graphically, the demand schedule shifts down for any given R, right? Like here we can see we have R1 in both. So as a result of this, Y decreases for any given R, right? We can see over here, the demand schedule shifted down, Y decreased for any given R, although here we're just showing it for R is equal to R1, but this is true for any given R. Now we have a lower level of output. So IS curve shifts to the left as one obtains lower output for any given R. So the key here is to remember the IS curve shifts because of any factor that affects demands for any given level of R, as that changes output in goods market equilibrium for any given level of the interest rate. For instance, over here, we saw if we have an increase in G, we saw output increases for any given R. Here we show for R1, we have a higher output, but this is true for any given interest rate. If we've taken this interest rate, we have a higher output. This interest rate, we have a higher output. So that's why the IS curve shifted towards the right with an increase in G. And if you look at an increase in taxes, we can see that output decreases for any given R. We saw it for R1, but if we've taken this level of interest rate, we can see output goes down. For this level of interest rate, output goes down. So for any given level of interest rate, since we have lower output now, IS curve shifts towards the left. Here, just a warning in place that the IS curve does not shift due to changes in interest rate. The IS curve shifts because of factors that affect demand other than interest rate. Any changes in investment due to changes in R will only cause movements in IS curve, not shifts. However, changes in investment unrelated to interest rate, say due to business confidence, cause shifts in IS curve, as that changes interest rate and as that changes investment, demand, and hence output for any given R. So just keep in mind, IS curve shifts because of factors that affect demand other than interest rate, as that will change output in goods market equilibrium for any given level of interest rate. Here we saw when G increased, output increased for any given R, so the entire curve shifted towards the right. Here we saw when taxes increased, output decreased for any given interest rate, so the entire curve shifted towards the left.